We often think of our daily lives as safe, structured, and completely predictable. We wake up, we go to our jobs, we travel for business, we download apps to meet new people, or we take weekend trips into the wilderness to clear our heads. We assume that the people we encounter along the way are just like us, busy living their own lives. But sometimes, without us ever knowing, we become targets. We get watched, we get followed, and we get hunted by people who operate in the dark corners of our world. These are three chilling accounts of ordinary people who found themselves in the crosshairs of terrifying situations where they were targeted by relentless forces. This first incident happened last fall when a commercial refrigeration technician had to travel to a small, isolated town in northern Pennsylvania for work. We will call him David. David's job was highly practical. He drove to different grocery stores and restaurants in smaller communities to repair walk-in freezers and cooling systems. At the time, his company was severely short-staffed, which meant he had to cover a massive territory and spend multiple nights on the road in unfamiliar places. The town he was sent to was the kind of place where everything shut down early, and there were more empty, boarded-up buildings than open businesses. David was scheduled to spend 3 nights there, working on the walk-in freezers at an older family-owned supermarket that had been experiencing severe temperature drops. Because of the limited lodging options in the area, his company booked him a room at a cheap motel located right on the dark, wooded edge of town. It was the only lodging option within a 30-mile radius that had any vacancies. David arrived at the motel a little after 7 on a Thursday evening. The sky was already pitch black, and the air was crisp and cold. The motel was a classic single-floor, U-shaped building where all the room doors faced directly out onto the gravel parking lot. It had perhaps 12 rooms in total, and the gravel lot only held 4 or 5 cars. The small front office was lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb and smelled strongly of cheap bleach, pine-scented cleaner, and old coffee. The woman working behind the desk was probably in her late 60s. She was friendly enough as she took his credit card. But David immediately noticed something distracted and uneasy about her behavior. She kept glancing past him, her eyes darting toward the dark window that overlooked the parking lot. When she handed David his metal key, her demeanor changed. She looked him directly in the eyes and gave him a strange warning. She told him that if anyone knocked on his door at night, he should not answer it under any circumstances, unless it was her or the motel owner. She also told him that if he heard anything weird outside, he should call the office immediately and avoid getting involved. She said this in a casual, matter-of-fact voice, as if she were simply giving him standard check-in instructions. It caught David completely off guard. He asked her if the area was unsafe, but she just shrugged and said there were some drifters around sometimes who liked to ask guests for money. David thought it was a very strange thing to say to a new guest, but he was exhausted from the long drive and just wanted to settle in. His room was located near the far end of the building, the second to last door on the right. Inside, the room was clean enough, but it was incredibly outdated. He noticed several cigarette burns on the top of the wooden dresser, and the cheap carpet had several large, dark stains. He brought his duffel bag inside, locked the door, and then drove down the road to a local gas station to grab some food. He bought a cold turkey sandwich, a bag of chips, and a bottle of soda. When David returned to the motel around 8, he noticed an older, dark green pickup truck parked just 2 spaces away from his truck. The green truck was running, but its headlights were completely turned off. David could not see the driver's face clearly because of the lack of lighting, but he noticed that the man did not look at him like a normal person would when someone walks by. The driver just sat perfectly still, with both of his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead into the darkness. David figured the man was just waiting for a guest, so he went inside his room, locked the door, and spent the next couple of hours eating his food and watching videos on his phone. Around 10:30, David took a hot shower and got into bed, hoping to get a good night of sleep before his long workday. About 20 minutes later, he heard footsteps outside his room on the concrete walkway. This did not bother him at first because he knew there were other guests staying at the motel. But then, the footsteps stopped right outside his door. He waited, expecting to hear someone unlock the room next door. But nothing happened. There was only absolute silence. After about 15 seconds, the footsteps finally moved on. A minute later, he heard them again. They were slowly coming back from the opposite direction, and they stopped right outside his door for a second time. There was no knock, just silence. And then the footsteps walked away once more. David got up and looked through the peephole, but the walkway was completely empty. He figured it was probably just someone who was drunk or confused about which room was theirs. A little after 11, David was half asleep when a loud, sharp knock rattled his door. He stayed completely still and waited. Then, the person knocked again in the exact same manner. He got up quietly, crept to the door, and looked through the peephole. There was absolutely nobody there. That made his stomach drop. The parking lot lights were dim, but the walkway in front of the rooms was completely empty, and there was nowhere for someone to hide so quickly. He stood there for a moment, then locked the deadbolt again, even though it was already locked. As he turned to go back to bed, he noticed that the curtain near the window had shifted slightly. It was not open wide, but there was a small gap that would allow someone standing outside to look directly into his room. He quickly pulled it completely shut, turned off the lamp, and stayed awake in the dark, listening. Right around midnight, David heard a faint sound that sounded like metal lightly scraping against metal near his door handle. He stepped as quietly as he could to the door. For the third time, he looked through the peephole. This time he saw movement. Someone was crouched very low, almost entirely underneath the peephole's field of view. He could only see the top of a dark baseball cap and one shoulder. David stood there frozen for about 5 seconds before the person suddenly stood up and sprinted away toward the far end of the building. David immediately called the front office. The woman answered, sounding annoyed at first, but when he told her that someone was trying to tamper with his lock, she got very quiet. She asked if he had opened the door, and he said no. She told him to stay inside and said the owner was going to check outside. A couple of minutes later, David saw headlights sweep across his curtains. Someone drove slowly through the parking lot and then left. The office called him back and told him that nobody was out there now, claiming it was probably just someone messing around. David asked if he should call the police, but the woman said it would not do any good since the person had already left. David barely slept after that, waking up at every tiny noise. He finally passed out around 3 in the morning, but at 5:15, he was jolted awake by the blaring sound of his truck's door opening alarm. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, carefully peering through the curtain. There was a tall man standing at the driver's side of his truck with the door half open. The man was wearing a dark jacket and a hat. David could not see his face because he was turned away, but then the man slowly looked straight toward David's room, as if he knew he was being watched. He shut the truck door and walked off fast toward the wooded road behind the motel. This time, David called 911. The police arrived 15 minutes later, took a report, and checked the truck. Nothing was missing because David never left anything valuable inside. One of the officers asked if he was sure he had locked it, which made David feel like they did not believe him. But the older officer on the scene seemed much more interested when David told him about the knocking and the crouching. The older officer asked the motel owner if they had security cameras. They did, but only one in the office and one pointing at the front entrance, with nothing covering David's side of the parking lot. Before the police left, the older officer told David that if it happened again, he should not open his door for any reason, and should leave as soon as he could in the morning. David asked if they thought it was random, and the officer said yes, but his face did not match his reassuring words. David had to work that day, so he decided to stay. During the daytime, everything felt normal. He worked at the supermarket from 7 in the morning until almost 6 in the evening. By the time he returned to the motel, it was dark again. He parked directly under the brightest light and carried all his heavy tools inside at once, so he would not have to go back out. The woman at the desk saw him and asked if he was okay. David admitted that he had not slept. She hesitated for a second, and then offered to move him to room 2, which was close to the office. David asked why she had not offered that the night before, and she said she did not think it was necessary. Then, she added that it usually does not happen 2 nights in a row. David asked what that meant, and she immediately acted like she had misspoken, saying she just meant that the drifters normally move on. This made David even more uneasy. He seriously considered packing up and driving to another hotel, but he was physically exhausted and told himself he could endure just one more night. Around 8, he got some food and brought it back to his room. While he was eating, he heard a vehicle driving slowly through the lot. He looked through the curtain and saw the same dark green pickup truck from the night before. It drove past his room, turned around, and parked at the very end of the lot with its lights off. David called the office, but the owner answered this time and sounded very irritated. He told David that if the truck was not blocking him in or damaging anything, there was nothing he could do. David asked if he knew who it was, and the owner simply said that people come and go. David sat there for an hour, checking the window every few minutes. The truck did not move. He turned off the lights and the television, hoping to make the room look empty, and tried to sleep with his clothes and boots still on. Sometime after 11, he heard someone walking outside again. The footsteps were incredibly slow. Suddenly, there was a soft tap, not on the door but on his window. David stayed frozen in bed. Then another tap came, closer to the center of the glass, followed by the sound of a fingernail dragging slowly down the window pane. David felt a wave of pure terror. He knew the person was standing inches away from him, and they knew he was in there pretending to be asleep. He grabbed his phone and started dialing 911. Before he could hit call, the tiny frosted bathroom window above the toilet began to rattle. Then he heard the sound of the empty room next to his opening. It was the sound of a key or a tool working the lock, followed by the door opening. David got out of bed, crouched near the shared wall, and called 911, whispering everything to the dispatcher. While he was talking, he heard a loud hit on the shared wall, as if someone was testing its solidness. Then, the bathroom window in his room began to slide open. David ran into the bathroom and shoved the window closed with both hands, feeling someone on the other side pushing back against him. He managed to lock the flimsy latch and backed away. The dispatcher told him officers were 2 minutes away. David could hear movement outside his front door now, suggesting there was more than one person. He grabbed a chair and jammed it under the doorknob. When the police arrived, he heard running outside. The officers found that his bathroom window screen had been removed and was lying in the bushes, and there were fresh pry marks on his truck and the empty room next door. The older officer later pulled David aside and asked if anyone was angry at him or knew where he was staying. David said no. The officer then revealed that 2 other out-of-town men staying alone for work had been targeted at this same motel in the last 6 months. They believed a group was following workers from job sites, waiting until they were isolated, and trying to get into their rooms. As David packed his bags under the watchful eye of the officers, he checked under his bed for any left-behind items. He found a folded piece of paper pushed against the wall. It was a piece of local newspaper, and on the back, someone had written his room number and his truck's license plate number in pen. They had been watching him long enough to write his details down. David left the motel immediately and drove 2 hours home in the middle of the night, never to return. His company was understanding of the situation, and they decided to send a different technician to finish the work the following week, making sure he was booked in a completely different town. David never found out who those men were or what they wanted, but the cold feeling of that fingernail on his window would stay with him forever. Now, let's look at the second story, which is equally terrifying, but takes place in a completely different setting. This story occurred in October of 2025. A young woman was living her life as a single person and decided to download the popular dating application Tinder to see if she could find a potential partner. After swiping through several profiles, she received a notification on her phone informing her that she had matched with a man named Killian. Killian's profile showed that he was in the military, stationed at an army base located not too far from her home. They began talking almost immediately, exchanging messages all day long. But within just a few weeks of consistent conversation, Killian's behavior took a dark and dramatic turn. he began showing signs of extreme possessiveness. He would send her messages demanding to know who she was talking to and why she was not responding to his snaps fast enough. He started saying things like, "You are mine, and if I cannot have you, then absolutely nobody else will." His behavior escalated to the point where he threatened to kill her if she ever unfriended him, blocked him, or stopped talking to him. The young woman was deeply alarmed by this, especially since they had never actually met in person or gone on a single date. Then in December, Killian suddenly unfriended her on Snapchat. She felt a massive wave of relief, thinking that he had finally decided to move on and leave her alone. She went back to living her normal life, feeling safe once again. But a few days ago, she received a notification that Killian had added her on Snapchat again. Fearing his previous threats of violence if she ever blocked or ignored him, she decided it was safer to accept the request to keep him calm. He immediately sent her a snap, saying that he had been thinking about her beautiful smile for the last 8 weeks, and that he kept thinking about what they could have been if he had not let his dark thoughts win. She responded with a short, polite message, trying not to anger him. They began talking again, but she was responding entirely out of fear. He continued to act like a possessive boyfriend, asking where she was and demanding that she turn on her Snapchat location sharing map so he could see her exact location at all times. She consistently refused, feeling very uneasy about his demands. Last Thursday, she was out driving around with a close friend until about 1 in the morning. Her friend dropped her off near her home, and they said their goodbyes. As she began walking up the dark alleyway leading to her house, she noticed a man standing in the shadows. She had never given Killian her address, so she did not think anything of it. But then the man suddenly called out her name. She answered, and when he stepped into the light of the street lamp, she recognized Killian's face. Her heart stopped, and she began to sweat and shake with fear. Before she could react, Killian lunged forward, grabbed her neck with his hand, and slammed her head hard against the brick wall of her house. He began shouting at her, demanding to know who she had been with, and why she was out so late with another man. He was choking her so tightly that tears filled her eyes and she struggled to breathe, genuinely believing he was going to murder her. Killian squeezed her throat harder and then threw her violently to the ground. She lay on the cold, wet earth, gasping for air and whimpering in pain. When she looked into his eyes, she saw absolutely no emotion or remorse. He sat on top of her chest, slapped her hard across the face, and then began choking her once again. As her vision began to fade and she felt herself passing out, she looked up at the dark sky and thought of her deceased dog, even smiling slightly as she prepared for the end. But suddenly, Killian let go of her neck. He cursed, saying he had to leave because the last bus of the night was departing in 3 minutes. He ran off into the dark, leaving her gasping on the ground. She was in deep shock and tried to call her best friend, but her vocal cords were too badly damaged from the choking to produce any sound. Her friend could only hear strange gasping noises and immediately rushed to her location. When she arrived at her friend's house, she collapsed onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes from sheer exhaustion. Her friend called the police to report the attack. The next day she gave her statement to the police. Realizing her life was in imminent danger, the police provided her with a panic alarm and tracking device that would immediately alert them of her location if she pressed the button. Just 3 days ago, she noticed she was being followed by a friend of Killian. If she had not been quickly picked up by a friend in a car, she believed she would have been attacked again. The police confirmed that Killian's clear intention was to take her life, and if he had owned a car, or if the bus had been scheduled later, she would be dead. She now lives in constant terror, knowing that he is out there, watching and waiting in the shadows. She hopes that sharing her experience will help protect other young women from falling prey to dangerous online predators who hide behind military uniforms and sweet words. Our third and final case takes us deep into the wilderness of the Smoky Mountains, where a man named Mike decided to take a solo camping trip. Mike was feeling severely burnt out from his demanding job and wanted nothing more than a few quiet days away from technology, work pressure, and people. He had completed solo backpacking trips in the past and felt confident in his survival skills. He packed his high-end camping gear and began the long drive into the mountains. A few hours before reaching his destination, he stopped at a quiet roadside diner to eat. The diner was empty except for a few elderly patrons drinking coffee, and a tired waitress who looked like she had worked there forever. While Mike was eating his burger, he noticed a man sitting a few stools down who was watching him out of the corner of his eye. The man eventually asked Mike where he was headed, and Mike mentioned he was going camping alone in the mountains. The man nodded and told him to be careful, adding that it gets very quiet out there at night. Mike did not think much of it, paid his bill, and left. He parked his car at an empty trailhead and began hiking into the forest. Because the trail was difficult, it took him longer than expected, and he had to set up his tent as the daylight was rapidly fading. By the time his camp was ready, the woods were dark. Mike built a small warm campfire and sat by it, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest. But after half an hour, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps on dry leaves. He looked up and saw a man standing about 40 feet away in the shadows, staring at him. Mike called out to ask if he was okay. The man stepped closer into the firelight and simply said hello. When Mike asked if he was camping nearby, the man asked if Mike was out there alone. Sensing danger, Mike lied and said his friends were arriving soon. The man nodded, turned, and walked back into the woods, but stopped at the edge of the darkness to stare back at the fire for several minutes before disappearing. Mike quickly put out the fire and got into his tent, unable to relax. An hour later, he heard footsteps circling his tent. The dry leaves crunched slowly as someone walked in circles around his shelter. Then the footsteps stopped right outside. Mike held his breath in absolute terror. He could hear the distinct sound of a man slowly breathing just outside the thin fabric of his tent. Every instinct told him to stay completely still and pretend to be asleep, fearing that any movement would trigger an attack. The steps eventually faded, only to return 10 minutes later. This terrifying pattern of circling and breathing continued for hours throughout the night. As the hours passed, the footsteps sounded more complex, and Mike became convinced that there was more than one person surrounding his tent. When the sun finally began to rise, Mike decided to pack his things as quickly as possible. The moment he unzipped his tent, he heard the immediate sound of multiple sets of footsteps running away into the deep woods. He had not imagined it. He had been surrounded by a group of people all night. He abandoned the rest of his gear, grabbed his backpack, and ran to his car. He fell asleep in his car from exhaustion, and when he woke up in the afternoon, he decided to hike back to retrieve his expensive gear, figuring they would be gone during the day. When he reached the clearing, he was stunned. His tent, sleeping bag, and all of his cooking supplies were completely gone. The only thing left was the cold circle of ashes from his fire. The group had watched him run, and the moment he was gone, they had stolen everything. Mike walked straight back to his car and drove home, never to go camping alone again. He realized that the quiet woods were not always peaceful, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness are not the bears or the wolves, but other humans who hunt in packs. These stories serve as a stark reminder that we must always trust our gut instincts. Whether you are staying in a remote motel, talking to someone on a dating app, or camping alone in the deep woods, pay attention to the warning signs. The world can be a dangerous place, and the people who wish to do us harm are often closer than we think. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.